Welcome to a special Ask Us Anything edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Centre for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. This is where panelists from the London Centre answer some of the questions you submit to us. If you'd like to submit a question for consideration, feel free to send one to us either through direct messaging on our Twitter page at the LCPR, the London Centre's Facebook page, and our Thought to Action Patreon page, patreon.com/thought-to-action. This edition of Ask Us Anything is available to the public, and soon we're going to be producing exclusive Ask Us Anything shows to our Patreon community. If you'd like to help us create more Ask Us Anything sessions, Thought to Action programs, and exclusive content, and keep you informed of what's happening, please join our Patreon page at patreon.com/thought-to-action. For more on the London Centre for Policy Research, who we are and what we do, visit our website, londoncentre.org. Also, feel free to share this video and comment on our discussion. It would greatly help us out here at the London Centre and our Thought to Action channel. For this edition of Ask Us Anything, let's welcome our panel from the London Centre. Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Centre, Senior Fellow Tim Wilson, Jay Homnick, Senior Fellow, and Bryan Griffin, Senior Fellow. Gentlemen, let's ask the first question. This one's from Deepwoods Creations. Since Congress is debating on how to spend our tax monies, is it possible to discuss foreign aid and America First doctrine? Many in the United States understood the need for humanitarian aid, and that's a good point. But how can we reform it, as it has now become a huge slush fund mixed in with developmental, economical, political, and military?
I'll take the first shot at this. I've been looking in for a long time at the United Nations and the US contributions to the United Nations. And most of this international aid is flowed by the US through the United Nations, which is, to my mind, the term slush fund, it becomes even more appropriate. So one of the questions that we raised some time back was, how much do we actually give to the United Nations as a whole? And back in the Bush era, Congress directed the Budget Office to ensure that all departments in the government reported how much they were sending to the United Nations. That stopped during the Obama years, and we still have no real solid, centralized, aggregated idea of how much. But my strong suggestion for what you're asking about would be for Congress to place a cap on overall overseas contributions, and for the rest of it then to be allocated, if you were, by State Department with congressional approval and oversight.
So let me jump in and add to that. I think there's, Chris, there's three parts to the question I want to touch. First, on the issue of taxation. There's no linkage between actual taxation, that is the amount of money we pay as citizens, to the overall budget. It's completely detached. We've been in deficit spending so long now, there's no real way of tracking income, the government income and expenditures, which is a huge issue, because this has allowed politicians to write unlimited checks, increasing the debt at an unlimited and unprecedented basis. So first off, there has to be a reattachment, if you will, of taxation to spending, and that's not been done for decades. And I think that's a real danger. Once politicians figure out they can write checks without any direct downside, they'll do it, and they do it. So therefore, they don't feel the need to actually rein in any of this outrageous spending. To Tim's point regarding budget, we have a process now that actually doesn't basically should have a revalidation of all budget every year. We don't do that. We basically say, if you got this amount of money last year, you get a certain percentage above that. Totally insane. This incentivizes waste by the fact if you don't spend the money you have in your budget, you'll be penalized by getting less or being eliminated the next year. What we need to do is reverse the trend to say that no, every year you must justify your budget. And if you don't spend as much as you did last year, you should be given an incentive to say that you've actually done something to benefit the government. And this doesn't happen. This goes into the foreign spending. So much of the foreign spending is dependent on essentially congressional members who see these as pet projects, or the State Department who allows this to become part of their policy of appeasement. So much of the foreign spending is done to essentially gain influence to foreign governments. I would argue from the perspective of libertarianism, it's not our job to tell other countries how to run their country, what they should do regarding social programs. One of the biggest I'm aware of is in Afghanistan. We've tied so much of our funding to making sure that certain social programs are emphasized by the government of Afghanistan. Why do we do that? It's not our job to determine how the Afghan people live their lives. So I think this is something that's expensive, unneeded, and to the point of the answer to the question, why are we doing that instead of trying to help fund the recovery of our own citizens first? And that comes to my last point. So much of the money we're spending right now regarding foreign policy could and should be used to the benefit of our own country. The idea that citizens only get $600 as the relief when countries are getting literally tens of thousands of dollars, which I would argue are being wasted, and adding to the deficit that politicians will use this deficit to benefit themselves with their pet projects, but don't care about the normal everyday citizen. So the whole system, I think, is flawed. It does not benefit the American people. And it's not necessarily about America first. It's about what benefit does all this foreign policy spending actually give individuals, citizens? And I would argue very little at this point.
Well, that's where, Tony, I think you're absolutely right. America first, however, does mean that the Americans people need to know that they're getting value for the money that is being spent by the government.
Exactly.
There's 2 points I'd like to make on this topic. Number one is that I think we need to have a reprioritization of how we handle foreign aid monies. I'd rather see foreign aid allocations go to US-based entities like USAID, IRI, DNI, things like that, because we know that the United Nations we have less accountability over. We know that they're less transparent. We know that they have a political agenda that they insert into all of their foreign aid spending. Second point on this topic is that this is indicative of a larger problem that we have in this country of Congress tacking on pet projects and their own personal agendas into larger bills like spending bills. I think we need to look into a conversation as a nation about reducing the complexity and the number of areas of subject matter that something like a spending bill or a defense bill or a foreign aid bill can cover at one time.
To pick up where Bryan left off, I think in general that at some point, and somebody should bring a challenge to the Supreme Court to argue that any bill that cannot be read in time is intrinsically unconstitutional. They just put out a bill with 5,000 pages and they gave it to 24 hours.
6,000.
It's 6,000. They have to vote on it, which means by definition, it cannot be that anyone voting on it read it. We know that for a fact. It's just human reality. It can't be done. Even the president didn't read it before he decided whether to veto or not. So just the concept of a bill has to be that the legislator knows what he's voting about and votes on it. That's the most basic threshold of constitutionality. And I think that a challenge like that, the Supreme Court would be hard put to try to defend this type of practice. It's an absurd practice. So, now they have some aides to take a quick look, try to give you highlights in the bill and, their bullet points. But the whole thing is absurd and it's calculated to be absurd. It's designed for the people not to know what they're going about because there's all kinds of tricks in there. Look at the Palestinian month. One of the main things that Israel liked about, again, Trump did a lot of things for Israel, but one of the things he did is that he cut off the funds to the Palestinian organization. And then they just slipped $250 million into that last bill with the COVID relief. So Trump couldn't veto the bill. So all the work he did for 4 years to cut off these Palestinian organizations, and where he said that unless you stop giving money to families of murderers, I'm not giving you any money, all that went by the wayside because they stuck it into the 6,000-page bill. And now the Palestinians got that $250 million.
I think, Jay, you're exactly right. There is a basic principle there. In the military, we tend to call it the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. And why is it that Congress consistently and persistently goes for these huge bills into which they can slide the pork, the slush funds, whatever you want to call it. It's because they can do that. There should also be a push by every voter to ask or even demand of their representatives that every bill be kept simple and clean.
This
There's
isn't
one
even
topic,
new.
that's what people vote on, not multiple broad topics.
This isn't even new. If you remember the Obamacare bill, all three of them, by the way, were extremely long, and Congress members were forced to kind of skim through it as best they could because there wasn't enough time to read the whole thing.
Right.
And there's another danger that happens with this, and that is that when the media covers either the passage of legislation or the refusal to vote on legislation, they usually cover the subject within that legislation that gets the most impact for their headline, and they leave out the other things that are there so they can assign false motives and false narratives behind why Congress or a certain party would vote for or not vote for a piece of legislation.
Absolutely.
There's an idea, a single subject amendment to the Constitution where a legislation can only have one subject matter and a certain number of limited length. It's probably worth considering at this point.
Right.
Why couldn't these bills be broken up into 100 bills or 200 bills, whatever it takes? One bill, one topic.
Right.
Well, that would be
No, I
too
think
easy.
it's so much of like the 302 issue. Is it the 302 issue? The issue of
Yep.
breaking up the monopoly of big tech.
Yep.
By the way,
Separate issue, standalone outside of any issues relating to funding. That should be a separate debate. It shouldn't be tied. Honestly, I understand what the president was trying to do. He's trying to take advantage of the current system. With that said, this should be a separate, clear issue that can be debated and resolved quickly through legislative process, not through budgetary process.
Yep.
Well, the problem is they can do it, and they're going to keep doing it this way unless
Right.
that's changed.
Yep.
Let's take in another question, gentlemen. This one's from Ray W. Thought to Action discussed our need to be prepared for an electromagnetic pulse attack with Ambassador Cooper recently. But how prepared are we really for any attack on our national grid?
Excellent question. Who wants to go first?
Well, Tony, I think you should lead on that one.
Well,
Why not?
the issue, and we've actually done U.S. Army War College seminars on this, the Center for Leadership Development, CSLD, up in Carlisle. And the issue comes down to the nature of how we live. Basically, everything at this point, based on the transition that started in the mid-90s and continues and accelerated through the teens, the 20 through the beginning of the century, is the move to digitization, that everything is now digital, everything is based on the internet. And while this has made life functionally much easier, you can bring up a location and use your GPS to get there rapidly. You have full access to information 24/7. All of this is based on lines of communication, computers that use energy. And so the moment that you lose energy, the moment you don't have power, all of these great things go away. And in addition to that, the basic functions of life, that is to say commerce, buying groceries, utilities, your automobile, the moment you lose power, lose the ability to use power, you lose society. Society has now become completely tied to digitization. That digitization is tied to power. And I don't think we fully thought through what happens if you lose it. I and others have talked about having essentially, for those of you in New York especially, understand this, the idea of having some level of package of a supply of food, supply of water that you have available to you should you lose power for any length of time. Because if you lose power, you lose basically your ability to survive. And I don't think today's cities have fully thought through what would happen if you lose power, bulk power, how everything shuts down. And I think that's the issue that relates to electromagnetic pulse. Electromagnetic pulse is a known phenomenon that happens either from the sun, Sunspots can create EMP. There's been mass blackouts caused by essentially sunspot activity, which has hampered modern society. I won't go into all the examples right now, but we should probably do a separate show on just this at some point. And the issue becomes, what do you do if you lose through an EMP incident, either man-made or natural? What happens to your ability to survive? And many of these instances have happened and reflect a very localized and short-term loss of power, which means a day or two and inconvenience. But the concern becomes, what happens if you have a complete loss of bulk power? That is, that your power is down for multiple days, if not weeks, and society around you it goes down as well. And this is not only a regional thing. What if this becomes national, where the entire grid goes down? And what do you do after a week of no power? And I don't think we fully thought through the impact of a loss of power caused by EMP.
It's another one where, as well, people have this tendency to rely on government. But in the event of a mass power outage, how many people have actually thought through ahead of time what their plan would be? As you rightly point out, Tony, if the power goes out, okay, it's inconvenient, especially if you're stuck in an elevator at the moment that it happens, but it's not unbearable. However, the water then goes off. And without water, people quickly have real serious issues. So that's why FEMA and every other person that ever looks at emergency preparedness recommends having at least a 3-day supply of water available.
Right.
My big plea is always to have a plan, to have thought through what happens, because the cities are one problem, if you like. Out in the country is another problem, because the other major thing that goes out is communication. Cell phones don't work. Actually getting a message to say, help me, becomes impossible. You are thrown onto your own resources.
I grew up in Tampa, and we had hurricanes that knocked out power for weeks at a time. I remember Hurricane Francis knocked out our power for 2 weeks. And I think about the difference between when we approached something like that, where people knew and basically understood that a power loss was coming, and then something like the beginning of COVID, where there was a run on toilet paper for absolutely no reason. And I think about the difference between those two scenarios, and the difference is the attitude towards the incident. Both were survivable. Both could be, prepared for, but the media certainly sensationalized the beginning of COVID more than they do, mid-hurricane power outage. And then also just the general panic. Keeping panic down is something that comes with, Tim, like you're saying, having a plan, being prepared, knowing basic non-electricity cooking capabilities, and having the right attitude about it, because losing power for weeks at a time is survivable.
Well, but that's part of the issue, Brian. You mentioned the fact that essentially you all prepared for the hurricane, and people are prepared for blizzards. But this is the challenge that I don't think people understand. What if the event happens everywhere? You all benefited from a government that was fairly well prepared with some level of notification that this was going to happen. An EMP event could happen either by sun, that creates the conditions for an entire loss of a nationwide power grid, and the whole grid goes down. And this is one of those things people understand. Bulk power is basically managed through the FERC and the Federal Electricity Commission, which actually tries to manage this process. And these things are private concerns. These are not owned by the government. These are utilities privately owned that the government tries to regulate. So the problem is, when you have all of this complexity, you don't necessarily have any guarantees it's going to function if everything goes down. Because when it happened in Florida, you had other states which were able to respond because they were functioning. What if they weren't functioning either? And that's the challenge I think people don't understand, is like, there's always the anticipation that help's going to come from somewhere. Well, what if all that help is actually tied up in trying to rectify its own crisis? Right. What if Alabama can't come to the aid of Florida? What if Georgia is tied up trying to deal with Atlanta and cannot come to Tampa's aid. So this is my concern that we have built on, and I think it's a realistic system of help, that other states, other entities will help others. But the challenge may become, what if everybody's tied up? The Department of Defense has always been anticipated as being that thing that'll come in and help. What if DOD is trying to save itself? And I don't think people have fully understood or comprehended that if something like this happens at a nationwide level, it would be a very difficult challenge for us to deal with.
It's a great point, Tony. And without a doubt, I think that we've become too reliant upon the government. And I think the government is set up to make people reliant upon it. So there needs to be a mindset shift with scenarios like that.
My father was a psychologist, and he attended a conference one time where there was a fellow named Reich, who was a student of Freud, was addressing all these psychologists. And he said he had a whole theory based on the fact that every single culture has a flood story. Every single culture has a story that there was a flood that wiped out the earth and they had to fight their way back from it. And he wanted to know, why does every culture have this story in common? So my father raised his hand and says, maybe there was a flood. And he was like in shock. That's the one thing he hadn't considered, that maybe there actually was a flood. But of course, the Bible tells you there was a flood that wiped everything out and everything had to start over. So the truth is, but it also includes a promise that'll never happen again. And that's already, if you're religious and you believe in God and a promise. But the point is that at the end of the day, everything is always going to have to be interlocked. The whole idea of creating a society is by interlocking all these things. So in the same conversation, we're pointing out that the internet is one point of vulnerability because it's all interlocked, but so is power, so is water. And so as you go down to the most basic things, if you poison, there were plenty of, Alistair MacLean wrote a novel, some others, about putting something in the water and all of a sudden the water is not usable. And so the point is, that's how we create a society, by putting these networks together. And once you do that, you create that vulnerability. It's just part of the game. So we can do as much effort as humans as we can to try to protect that, but there's always going to be a degree of vulnerability.
Well, I agree. And I think it's a great idea, Jay, but the problem is this, everything is now digital. And the moment you lose digital, you lose the ability to actually conduct any commerce. If you go to the local store, even if you have cash, they won't take it because they have no way of actually accounting for it. So this is where I think we need to take a step back. When you're driving, your car may work after an event, but what if your GPS doesn't? Mm-hmm. How many people could you pick up your phone and dial by their number right now? You couldn't. It's very difficult. I'm saying that we've actually created conditions for us to be completely dependent on digitization to the point that we have a hard time functioning with analog technology. How many of you have a lensatic compass right now in your house? Could you pick up your compass and go actually use a map? How many of you have maps, hard copy maps in your car that you could use to drive? 20 years ago, everybody had maps in their cars. As a matter of fact, ADC here in Washington had maps for all the different neighborhoods you could go to and navigate into. That doesn't really exist now. I mean, you could buy it, but most people don't prepare. So while we may as a group understand this and prepare a little bit, what happens to those 85% of people who don't? And how do we deal with them? It could create quite a catastrophic condition for society if people don't understand what needs to be done here to protect themselves.
And a little bit of preparation. I mean, it's interesting to go back to the biblical analogy. Noah was the ultimate prepper.
Yeah.
My plea is always to people to just think about it a little bit. Prior preparation and planning prevent poor performance. It's another militarism, the 7 Ps we call it. But just think about what might happen to you. What is the worst case scenario and what can you do to alleviate it? It's the classic thing of, in the military, you will have heard, everybody has a go bag.
Yeah.
You've got a go bag with some bottles of water in and enough food to keep you going for a day or two while you deal with whatever.
Yeah. Yeah,
That
no,
alone will save many, many lives in the event of a national power outage.
yeah, no, I've got within literally a few feet of me a full month of food, a safe of weapons, some hard currency, and some water that would be sufficient for us to survive at least a month, realistically a month, without any power if we needed to, or be able to put it into a vehicle and go. That's all mobile.
Yep.
And it's not a paranoia. It's just, hey, things could go wrong, and
Right.
what are you going to do to survive? And I've made this point to people who live in big cities who basically live off of buying things at the bodega. Well, what if the bodega's not there? What are you gonna do? And I think we who live in the suburbs are far more apt to survive than those who live in the big city, who literally would be scrambling for resources to the point of where they become almost like animals to survive.
Absolutely, Tony. I'd just like to reinforce your point. People may wonder why you say the shops wouldn't be open. It's because their cash registers work on electronics.
Right.
And basically the store owners are not going to be able to even take cash, because nowadays, dare I say, many of the people that work for them can't add up.
Yeah.
You know, their math is just not good enough, and they don't have a system for writing down what
Right.
they've sold and how much they paid for it.
And if you do that, and if it becomes like the run on the bank and It's a Wonderful Life, you won't be able to do much of anything, because again, you're talking about thousands of individuals, probably near panic, trying to do things. And by the way, how do you replenish?
Yep.
If you've lost the ability to use digitization, what happens to these vehicles who have to show up and drop off stuff every day just in time?
Yep.
The just-in-time system is designed to be very economic, but not resilient. And I think that's a real problem.
If you remember outside of Houston, when they were running away from that hurricane, and then they just ran out of gas, and then all the cars were stuck right in the middle of the road for miles.
Yeah.
And the gas stations won't be working anyway, because their pumps are electronic and they mostly take credit cards, which won't work.
It also boils down to education. Young people should be learning more about basic survival skills. I mean, the Boy Scouts get blasted by the PC forces over the years, but at least it taught young people how to start a fire, how to forage for food, how to interact with other people, how to deal with things when you're either lost in the wilderness or basically without power.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd far rather be stuck with somebody who trained as an Eagle Scout than didn't.
Absolutely. And there's always a discussion about teaching financial education in the schools. And they don't do that. That's another form of, let's say, modern survival or anything like that. And that might be a different discussion for a different day. But what about basic survival skills? The good thing is there are a lot of resources on the internet. There are places you can go on YouTube. There are plenty of websites where people can just get on and learn. While we sit here and try
On
to
our
advance
website, sorry, Chris, but I have to say, on our website, we have a nuclear survival guide, which includes tips
That's
for
right.
preparations.
Yeah.
And that's where I was going. The site is londoncenter.org. We have the tips for preparations there. Also, as Tony said, there are ways to put food together, non-perishable food or food that lasts a long time. You can store. There are places that sell this sort of thing. Get on, read up a little bit. While we try to go on the internet and advance our skills in computers or for jobs in the future, maybe we should also take some of that time and learn about basic survival.
Yeah. I think that's something we should actually look at. One of the things we've done as this London Center is practical policy. And I really appreciate the comment regarding high school. One of the things I noticed when I went to high school, the two classes which were most productive for me was home economics. I was the only guy in a home economics class where they talked about budget and basic things you do around the house. You know, by the way, balancing a checkbook and all that sort of thing, you know, learning the basic ideas of budget's a pretty good idea, by the way. I wish Congress would learn those points too, regarding our earlier conversation, which they haven't done. And then secondly, the other thing I did was touch typing, which, you know, I was, again, the only guy. This was 1980. So I was the only guy in this class of women. I was literally, you know, all these other, there was a female thing to become a touch typist. Like, well, I'm happy I did that because now I can type with impunity. But the idea is that we should be encouraging individuals to look at what is practical regarding their survival skills, what will benefit them. And I got to tell you, boy, I'm getting way off topic here, but one of the things I was most disappointed by the CDC during this pandemic is not once did I see them going out and talking about physical fitness, mental activities, positive mental outlook, proper diet, all the things that you could do to prevent the potential infection by making sure you're healthy. Did I miss that? Did anybody see the CDC out there?
No, absolutely not.
Pushing
They
good
really
habits,
blew it.
pushing physical fitness to say, well, we don't know the answers on COVID. We do know these things will help you to, in case you are exposed, to either shorten the time of recovery or prevent it altogether. Why did that not happen? Why? That's a very practical thing that anybody who's concerned about the health of individuals, American citizens, should be out there promoting. I don't understand why they didn't happen.
Because that itself could have been an opportunity to imbue some cheerfulness into the whole situation.
Right.
If you brought out Dwayne Johnson, you brought out some people and talking about keep your fitness up, and that would be part of the face of the government, it would have really lifted the spirits tremendously.
Absolutely.
Opportunity.
COVID is a good example that the worst case scenario can happen. And I think the idea is don't treat it like it's a dream or an impossibility.
Right.
Be prepared, have conversations, don't obsess over the worst case scenario, but be prepared. Talk to your family, have a plan, make sure you understand basic principles like we've been talking about to be able to execute at home.
That's a great point.
Thank you, Brian, because that does raise another really good point about, yes, think about it and have a plan, but also discuss that plan with your family, because the chances are that an emergency, a real serious emergency, will blindside almost everybody. It will come unexpectedly. Who expected COVID? And let's put it like this. One of the thoughts that I always have about mass shootings and the like is that they often happen in shopping malls.
Right.
So the kids have gone off to a shop somewhere else. The wife is shopping in her stores and you're shopping in your whatever, Where are you going to meet? How are you going to find them? Are you going to run towards the sound of firing just in the hope that you'll meet your family? No, have an RV already arranged.
Well, look, that's the other issue of communication. What if your phones go down? I mean, we've got in our truck a set of high frequency, theoretically will survive an EMP event, or we'd at least have communication between a couple of vehicles. We get, I think, 3 radios, three vehicles to at least be able to facilitate our being able to talk to each other in case something happens. But people need to think through this. And as Tim said, you need to think about scenarios that would benefit you and how to rally.
It's always worth doing the what if this happens?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to handle it? And how is my family going to be safe?
Right.
Right. I remember that one of the things that happened here in the DC area is when we had something called the derecho a few years ago, where basically a long storm came through and it basically turned up the area. No communications were possible for about 24 hours. And one of the things people noted is that police couldn't come because there was no 911, and the military wasn't ready to respond because the military have their own family to deal with.
Yeah.
So you cannot presume that you're going to have instant support in a disaster. You're going to have some level of ability to sustain yourself and your family for a certain amount of time. And I think that's the way everybody should, as Bryan said, COVID should be a wake-up call for people to understand what the reality is. And you then have to take upon yourself to build a response to that adverse reality, no matter what it may be.
Right.
And we in the suburbs, as you said, have an advantage. We can at least eat our lawns for a few days.
That's right.
If you're all enjoying the content that we're presenting here on Ask Us Anything, and of course our Thought to Action program from the London Center for Policy Research, and you'd like to help us produce this content and put it together, please feel free to be part of our Patreon page, our Patreon community. That's patreon.com/thought-to-action. That's patreon.com/thought-to-action. This is embarrassing. I should have known that. But we cannot do this without you, and we do appreciate your help. Also, if you'd like to ask us questions for our next Ask Us Anything, feel free to DM us on our social media or our Patreon page and be part of our Patreon community. What also would help us out is if you'd like, comment, and share this video with your friends, your colleagues, and your social media. We appreciate you spreading the word. Thank you very much. Let's do question 3, gentlemen. This one's from Andrea B. With the election cybersecurity issues out in the open, what must our nation do in the coming months to strengthen our infrastructure and financial markets from sophisticated cyber attacks?
I'm a huge believer that the free markets drive a lot of this, and banks spend, for example, billions every year on cybersecurity for their systems. Now, the government has a need, a desire, and a duty, if you like, to lead the way. What I personally would like to see is the government more closely involved with the private sector and working in real partnership, the way we have now seen with Operation Warp Speed. We know that they can. So let's try and encourage it in other areas as well, and particularly cybersecurity. At the moment, I'm a huge believer that there is no such thing as a totally secure cyber system or electronic system. If you look at what America did to Iran with Stuxnet, we destroyed Iranian centrifuges that were not connected to the internet. We did that by introducing a virus which affected a mechanical component. Our voting systems are also electronic systems, and they are not hugely expensive, deeply protected, with people monitoring them every day against live attacks. Somehow we need to come up with a system that is closer for voting to the bank hole in the wall, which systems are closely monitored. And it's interesting to me that the hole in the wall where you get cash out actually has a live video camera and a taped video facility in every single one. That something like that needs to happen. Like I say, an Operation Warp Speed that involves cybersecurity, particularly for elections, which are the most vital function of our democracy.
Commerce does have incentive to make sure that all transactions are secure. So therefore, a lot of money goes into that. Amazon, eBay, Zoom, there's a great deal of effort done to pursue, and to Tim's point, then the banking industry above that also makes great investments. The problem is that because there's systems of systems, one of the things that we've noted through the solar wind hack and others is that a lot of the time the hacking happens through vendors. That is to say that you have to have a second or third party that you have to have access to conduct business. Much of that, I wish Bennett McFadder, our board member and senior fellow, was here because he could talk about the use of middleware, of how systems designed to do one thing do it well, but they're not necessarily designed to interact with other systems. Therefore, you need something that will bridge that. So the solar wind hack, for example, really was conducted by allowing for this middleware that manages internal activities, internal integration, if you will, of all these systems for a given company to then talk to other companies. It creates vulnerabilities because the moment you compromise that middleware, you own everything else. So this is where you have to have a very strong understanding of architecture and how these vulnerabilities can be used to benefit others. And to Tim's point, you have to have a good public government partnership, because public concerns don't want to report on hacks because they got to report to the board of directors, and their fiduciary responsibility is to keep that company whole. And when you have to go to your stockholders or board and say, oh, by the way, our company's not secure, that public disclosure will tank your stock. You become essentially a pariah. And in many instances, you will crash your company if you announce that. So there's a real dilemma about security. How do I go about maintaining my company's security and not disclose something that's going to end it? At the same time, telling the government, hey, we were hacked, we need help. It's a very difficult situation where you have to have the ability to share information without regard to consequences. And those consequences are very difficult for people to fully understand how being truthful in your disclosure does not necessarily help your company. It actually may end your company. So
That's an interesting analogy too, Tony, with what's gone on in this election, and whether the government is losing the trust because they're unwilling to report to their board of directors, otherwise known as we the people, the truth of what has gone on. That, you know, there seems to be an awful lot of denial about even the possibility that the voting machines could have been hacked.
well, I think that's where there's been, I don't know when this is going to be airing, but right now at this moment, there's been the disclosure of the President Trump discussion with the Georgia Secretary of State regarding the election. And the leak of the phone call, it's not, and they didn't leak the entire phone call, they did bits and pieces of it. Basically, what President Trump was saying is that there's 10,000 plus missing votes. There should be more votes in some locations than have been accounted for. He's not saying go find the votes, you make them up. He's saying, hey, statistically, these things are missing. Where are they? And why aren't you going to find them? That's completely different from what's being portrayed in the mainstream media. And that's to the point. It's like, where do these votes go? Where are they? I'm just asking you to account for them. I'm not asking you to make them up. I'm asking you to go find them. And this is where this digital piece becomes very problematic, because what if they know that those votes are missing because of malfeasance? Are they going to own up to that? Are they going to say, man, did we really F up on this and allow this to happen? No, they're not going to admit anything that happened that would put them into a bad light. And I think that's what we're faced with here. And again, this is not about, you need to find those votes to make me win. You need to account for where these votes went on the election day. That's what he's saying. And it's being completely misportrayed.
Over and over. I mean, the plea is, I think, what we all want, what we all understand is that we want free and fair elections. Fair means that those who are entitled to vote can vote, and those who aren't entitled to vote cannot vote, nor can people vote multiple times. All of this is happening, and it's become almost accepted. I actually heard somebody on the news the other day saying, you know, somebody very senior from government saying, well, of course there's fraud goes on. It's always gone on. Unacceptable. It is not right. And at the level that it appears to have gone on this election, no future election, no elected representative can claim legitimately to represent the people, because we don't know that for sure.
One final question, gentlemen. This is from James P. What is the Great Reset? And how do we as a free nation fight any international and potentially federal imposition of such a plan?
Excellent question.
I can start on this one if
please.
it's all right with you guys. The Great Reset is a concept that's been circulating among intelligentsia, the academia, you name it, but really it's been coming out of the World Economic Forum lately, which is a group of individuals who meet in Davos, Switzerland, and like to come up with ways that they think that they can improve how the world is run and how you run or operate in your own life. So the Great Reset is, how do we basically redistribute wealth or change the economic system of various countries around the world to make things more fair according to the terms that we define, right? Because fair has to be defined by somebody's terms. And if you're going to be doing it from the top down, like the Great Reset wants, then fair is getting defined by a group of people that do not include, don't include you, don't include most people about whom these decisions would affect. The pretext right now for a lot of conversations about the Great Reset is COVID. With this disaster going on, with this pandemic going on, can we, these thinkers, these people who know better than everybody else, use this opportunity to restructure society or economies or push ideas, especially centralized ideas, into the public sphere and have them be accepted? You know, the second part of the question I think here is what do you do about something like this? And the answer is education. There's a lot of attacks on the free market right now. There's a lot of growing support for things like socialism. And I think without proper education to understand that it's solely because of the free market that over the last 200 years, most people around the world have access to food, medicine, and basic luxuries, that needs to be underscored and push the socialist agenda. Socialist economics must be pushed back against. If it's coming into curriculum, if it's coming into political demagoguery, or conversations like this coming out of the World Economic Forum. My final point on this is that if you want to call yourself the World Economic Forum, then a basic understanding of economics needs to be at the center of what you do. And I think a basic understanding of economics is lacking from anyone that would push the idea that people, individuals, should not be the decider of the exchanges that they make. Voluntary, free, and fair exchange through a free market system has been the most prosperous and the most beneficial thing to happen to humanity over the last several hundred years.
Well
said.
put, Bryan.
And I think adding to that, a couple other factors. First, adding to this reset is the idea of using climate science as a method of controlling energy production, and those sorts of things which go with what Bryan's talking about. There is no climate crisis. There is climate change based on the fact that climate has been changing since the Earth cooled from its molten state several billion years ago. It is ever present and ever moving. Will we see diminution of resources, of oxygen, and all these CO2? Maybe, but we've always been able to adapt to whatever the circumstance is, and there's no great swing envisioned of any climate. The world is not ending in 12 years, as Ocasio-Cortez has said. There's some other factors here what I think people don't understand about the reset that need to be expanded on. In addition to controlling energy through climate change, basically having the government start picking winners and losers, is the idea that we need to move to this top-down governance that Bryan has alluded to. The idea here is that they want to decide for you what you have access to. One of their key ideas, which I find fascinating and hilarious, is the idea that, you no longer will own anything. You'll rent everything. You will not have any content that you can download or maintain as your own. That's something you will rent. You will have rented spaces. Everything will become common. And one of those things, the idea of privacy, individual freedom and privacy, becomes a thing of the past, because we will tell you what we think is best for you. It's another form of communism taken to an extreme, in my judgment. And maybe I'm wrong on this. I don't think so, though.
I want to make
about the idea that the government, individuals who are unelected, unaccountable, know better than you about what's best for you.
Right. Tony, I want to make a point about the climate, because I think that was, before COVID, that was the other pretext that was being laid to have all of the centralization happen. And, the idea that we disagree with their concept of whether or not we're in a crisis doesn't mean that we don't believe in pollution or taking care of the environment. But guess what? Free trade, free market is better at taking care of the environment than authoritarian big governments also. And if they think they're going to solve that problem, wealth inequality, or anything else, even by their own terms, then they just simply don't understand basic economics and the history of the role of government in people's lives. And if you don't believe that, look at the environmental track record of the biggest government in the world, which is China. They have a horrible environmental track record because there's no innovation and there's no consumer ability to have accountability over those who are the worst polluters, which is government.
So remember, when people like Greta Thunberg come out and thump us in the West about our issues, she doesn't mention the Indians or Chinese, who are the biggest offenders on the planet. And why is that? Why would you not mention the biggest offender of the biggest polluter on the planet? Because you're paid for, because you're bought, because others have somehow convinced you that these people who are actually the bad guys aren't, because they're paying your bills, apparently. And let me be clear on this, because I'm not saying anything I don't think it's that controversial. I got a degree in environmental studies, and do you all know what the other than maybe dams and hydro, do you know what the most efficient source of energy is that's cleanest?
Nuclear.
And it's the safest too. If you look at the stats regarding who actually dies and what the events are. I mean, yeah, Chernobyl was bad. Don't get me wrong, but like, same thing with aviation. Aviation is the safest way to travel, but do things when it goes bad, it goes really, really bad. But still, percentage-wise, it's still aviation flying is the safest. Same as nuclear, but you don't hear that. You don't hear that fact. And this is something that I find very troubling about the whole environmental movement. They want to go to more efficient, more effective. They say this, they don't really, but they say this, that, we want to create all these efficient, they don't. because if they did, they would be working right now to invoke nuclear energy. Guess which country has been the most effective in using energy, nuclear energy?
France.
France.
Any guesses?
France.
France. Because they figured this out long before we did. And right now, a huge percentage of their society depends on cheap nuclear energy, effective nuclear energy. Why don't we have this debate? Why, France is got so many things wrong with it. This is one thing they do right. Why don't we talk about this?
Mhm.
And if you go to some of these major metropolitan areas, especially I've never been there. I haven't been there for a long time. San Francisco Bay. Do you all know what's in San Francisco Bay from, I'm told? Plastic. Lots of plastic. Plastic has been introduced into our environment in humongous tons of stuff. And this is in the open ocean. Why aren't we talking about plastics as an environmental concern?
Yeah.
Because it's not about the environment.
Yep.
It's not about pollution. It's not
On
about
that-
what's effective. It's about political control, as Bryan said.
On that note, I have to add as well, I find it slightly embarrassing that at the Great Reset was touted at Davos, as Bryan said, mainly by Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales of my former country. And his great thing was that his great solution to this is the introduction of a carbon tax. Now, that, as far as I'm concerned, is a complete scam to try and finance some form of world governance. But a carbon tax is not something where the worst polluters, as you say, Tony, China is not going to pay the greatest element of it. They're going to try and take money from people in countries like ours in the West. They're asking basically America to pay for their pet projects.
Yeah.
And I'm not up for that. Like I say, I'm embarrassed that Prince Charles would come out with such rubbish.
Well,
wanna make it-
I think the great resets, they happen all the time and they never work.
Yeah.
I went to a summer camp, and the first few weeks of the season, there was a few bunks that were dominating. So they said, all right, let's stop the season and rearrange everybody. But it ended up being the same guys who were good. Their teams were the ones that were going to win. And these great resets, they're, in scouting we had it, and all these situations. I was in a classroom where the teacher said, whoever gets 100 on the spelling test will get a star. And then I was getting all the hundreds. Every week I got 100. So it killed the whole thing for the whole class. So what she started doing was she started taking -2 for penmanship, to level me down so that there should be a competition. But at the end, at the end of the day, the people who are excellent are going to rise to the top unless you crunch everybody down. And you have Cuba, where if a light bulb breaks in your house, you have to fill out a report to the government to explain how the light bulb broke. And nobody has any ability to express themselves or to expand their human potential. I think if you did a reset where everyone started with the same amount of money, in 20 years from now, Bloomberg would be a billionaire again. It's like certain things, the same people would be the movie stars. The people who rise to the top in various things, and the only way to stop it, you can't make the other people rise to the top the same way. The only way to stop it is by crunching everybody down. Now, philanthropy, that was always understood that people who are fortunate in life shared with others, and it turns out that the right wing in the United States actually performs more philanthropy than the left wing, who uses the government as their means of philanthropy.
A great
And so
reset.
consequently,
Agree.
freedom still works the best, but it's not going to give you equal results. Kurt Vonnegut, who was a leftist, but he wrote that great short story about how they had to make everyone equal, so the guys who were fast had to carry weights around. That's something Bergeron. You remember that story? It was a classic short story, and in one short story, he made the whole point. You have to let people be who they are. If Kurt Vonnegut's a great novelist, he's going to sell novels. You can't stop that from happening, and you don't want to stop that from happening.
The question that should be asked anytime says great reset is, what are you resetting? And what's the goal? This great reset is a goal to centralize and consolidate power. Those types of great resets have always failed in history. Castro tried it in Cuba. Cuba is destitute. Lenin tried it in Russia, failed miserably, destitution, murder. it never works. Now, there was a great reset that did work, and this was 200 years ago when America reset the idea of whether people should have the ability to have control over their government and their own sovereignty.
Right.
And that type of reset was founded in the idea that freedom is the only type of reset, is the only type of agenda that a reset should have to actually improve the quality of life of people. So that, to that regard, I think a great reset can work, but this is not that type of reset. And I want to make one other point that goes back to anything that becomes the pretext of the great reset, whether it be getting more hands into, getting more money into people's hands, concern for the environment, etc. The dichotomy is not one side doesn't care about those issues and the other side does. The dichotomy is one side wants those issues to be tackled through freedom and competition, innovation, and building the moral fabric of society. And the other side wants to do it top down. And we know that top down solutions to problems, climate, wealth inequality, et cetera, don't work. Wealth inequality is enhanced when it comes from the top down. The free market is the great equalizer.
Right.
Same thing can be said for climate, healthcare, et cetera. So the narrative right now is that we're arguing against a great reset. We must not care about these issues. That is patently false. We believe that freedom and free market exchange better achieves those things than a great reset that would be top down.
Well said again, Bryan.
And
Yeah, so Bryan, to back up your point,
don't forget that in South America, the still most best place to live is Chile, which Milton Friedman went down there and put his ideas to work. And all the other left-wing places don't do as well as Chile.
yeah. Well, to Bryan's point, I think what we've recognized is something called American exceptionalism. Is not about Americans being better. It's about the fact that our freedoms provide an opportunity that does not exist in other countries. Mm-hmm. That the individual, the rights of the individual, the innovations of the individual is the bedrock for the larger collective success of the society. It's not outcome-based, it's individual-based. The idea is that we're not trying to have a government that dictates to you what's possible. It's the individual who's able to thrive and be able to actually enjoy the fact that this freedom then creates conditions for success. It's a bit scary because it's not controllable, it's not dictated, but that's why we've been so successful as a nation. That's why we have such intellectual benefit. Great inventions happen here. They don't happen in other countries. It's not because of their people aren't as stupid. They aren't as free. They don't have the freedom to actually thrive, to try things.
They don't have the great think tank.
You would not have an Elon Musk doing well in Venezuela.
Well said, Tony, again. It is great working with you guys.
Well, if people would just listen to us, we'd be better off. Right? Talk about top down.
Yeah, watch more of our videos. There we go.
That's right. Watch more of our videos.
Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of you for taking part in our Ask Us Anything session, and thank you for watching. There will be more to come, and you can keep up to date with our Thought to Action show and find it on our YouTube channel, Apple Podcast. Yes, we have an audio version of the show, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other digital outlets. You can also find the show on thoughttoaction.tv, thoughttoactionpodcast.com, and on our London Center for Policy Research website, londoncenter.org. If you'd like to help us create more content like this and enjoy future exclusive versions of Ask Us Anything and other special content, please join our Patreon community, patreon.com/thoughttoaction. That's patreon.com/thoughttoaction. Also, it would really help us out if you shared this video, shared our other videos, and comment on them. Join the conversation. Again, visit our website, londoncenter.org, for more info on the London Center for Policy Research. Thank you once again for being with us on Thought to Action's Ask Us Anything.